A flight attendant slapped a quiet black teen right in front of everyone, just because he was holding a Bible. Nobody stood up for him, not one passenger. But what no one knew was who he really was. And when he made one silent move, it reached someone with more power than the airline itself. By the time the plane landed, the flight crew wasn't in control anymore. And that flight? It became the beginning of something they never saw coming. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you believe quiet people can change powerful systems, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for more stories like this. 17-year-old Jalen Rivers walked down the narrow plane aisle with a quiet grace that didn't match his age. His shirt was tucked in neatly, and his old leather Bible rested gently in his left hand, tucked close to his chest like something fragile. It had belonged to his grandmother, and it still smelled faintly of lavender and dust. He didn't make eye contact with anyone, but he noticed everything. The pause in conversation as he passed, the slight tightening of a jaw, the way one woman pulled her handbag closer. He didn't take it personally. He had seen these small things all his life. His seat was 12A, right by the window. He sat down and placed the Bible in his lap, opening it to a folded page marked years ago in shaky cursive. Exodus 14:14. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." He read it again without blinking. The cabin around him filled up. Business travelers, couples, and college kids made small talk or scrolled through their phones. The flight attendants walked up and down the aisles with mechanical smiles and clipped voices. One of them, a woman with sharp features and blonde hair tied in a bun, paused near his row. Her name tag read Sharon. She looked at him quickly, then kept walking. A few minutes later, she returned to hand the passenger in 12B a water bottle and snack, but she skipped Jalen entirely. He didn't say anything. He only glanced down at his Bible and turned the page. His grandmother used to say, "Let them show you who they are, and then let God handle it." As the safety announcements played, Sharon passed by again. This time, she stopped near his row and stared at him for a second too long. Her eyes dropped to the Bible in his lap. She didn't say anything, just raised her brows slightly and walked on. Jalen didn't look up. He tightened his grip on the cover of the book and stared straight ahead. Something told him this flight was not going to be simple. The engines hummed low beneath the cabin floor as the plane taxied. Jalen kept his seatbelt fastened, both hands resting lightly over the Bible. The woman next to him, a red-haired lady in her 50s, gave him a polite smile, then turned her head back to the window. Jalen didn't mind. He was used to being the quiet one, the one people glanced at and then forgot. But something about today felt different, heavier. As the plane lifted off the runway and climbed into the gray afternoon sky, Sharon returned with a tray cart. She moved down the aisle, handing out ginger ale, pretzels, and those small packets of cookies. She smiled wide for the older man in 11C, chuckled politely with the couple in 11D and E, and even offered them extra snacks in case they got hungry later. Then she reached Jalen's row. Her smile disappeared. She leaned over 12B and spoke only to the red-haired woman. "Snack or drink for you?" she asked in a soft voice. The woman declined kindly, and Sharon nodded, then turned her body as if Jalen wasn't there. The cart rattled slightly as she started to push it forward. "Excuse me," Jalen said, gently raising his hand. His voice was calm. "May I have a water, please?" Sharon paused. Her eyes settled on him like she was seeing him for the first time, but not in a friendly way. "We'll be back," she said, her tone flat, already turning away. She didn't come back. Jalen sat back in his seat, lips pressed together, eyes low. He didn't say anything more. The Bible rested in his lap, unopened now. His throat was dry, but not from thirst. He knew what this was. Not loud, not obvious. Just enough to make someone feel small. And he'd learned that those quiet cuts, those were the ones that stayed. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Seatbelt signs were off, and passengers began leaning back, flipping through in-flight magazines or nodding off with neck pillows. Jalen sat still, his hands folded over the Bible like it was the only familiar thing in the room. The red-haired woman beside him had taken out a novel and didn't look his way again. He didn't blame her. Most people didn't want to get involved, not with things that made them uncomfortable. He had stopped expecting otherwise. From his window seat, the sky looked wide and endless, a pale stretch of cloudless blue. But even with all that space outside, Jalen felt the tightness creeping in. It wasn't fear. It was something slower and deeper, like a kind of quiet pressure on his chest. The way Sharon looked at him, the way her voice changed when she spoke to others, but stayed cold and flat with him. It wasn't new. It was just sharper today. And for the first time in a long while, he felt himself getting tired. He reached up and pressed the overhead button. Not out of defiance, but because he still hadn't gotten water. He didn't expect much. A minute passed, then 2. No one came. The button light stayed on, glowing softly above him like a reminder. Across the aisle, a man in business clothes had already gotten his drink refilled. Twice. Sharon had laughed with him as she handed over a second can of soda. Jalen caught her glancing in his direction once, but she didn't come over. She looked right through him like he wasn't worth her time. The red-haired woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She saw the light still on above them. She hesitated, then cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, catching Sharon's attention as she passed again. "This young man's call light has been on for a while. He's just asking for water." Sharon's smile vanished for a second. She turned her eyes on Jalen and gave a tight, practiced grin. "We're short today," she said. "He'll need to wait." She walked off before either of them could say anything. The woman next to him gave a small, awkward smile, then looked back at her book. Her cheeks flushed a little. Jalen nodded politely to her. He appreciated that she spoke up, even if it didn't change anything. He didn't blame her silence now. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. He remembered something his father used to say whenever things felt unfair. There's power in staying calm. Just don't let them trick you into showing your anger. That's what they're really looking for. Jalen wasn't angry. Not yet. But something inside him had started to shift. Something quiet. Something steady. Like a fuse lit underwater. The plane rocked slightly as it hit a patch of light turbulence. Nothing serious, but enough to jostle the drink carts and make the overhead compartments creak. Jalen kept still, his hands resting gently on the Bible, fingers tracing the faded lines of the cracked leather. He stared at the seat back in front of him, not really seeing it. His thoughts were somewhere else, half in the cabin, half back home. He thought about his grandmother, how she used to hum old hymns while folding laundry, how her fingers were always cold, but her voice was warm. She had given him this Bible on her last Christmas. He remembered how her hands trembled when she placed it in his, and how she'd whispered, "Don't let the world turn you bitter, baby. Keep your heart clean, and the rest will follow." At the time, he didn't fully understand what she meant. Now sitting 30,000 feet in the air with a call light ignored and a cold shoulder from a stranger in uniform, it made too much sense. Another rattle shook the tray table in front of him. Sharon passed by again, this time heading toward the front of the plane. She was laughing softly with the man in 11C, a man who hadn't even had to ask twice for service. Jalen watched her briefly, then looked down at his lap. He shifted the Bible slightly, holding it more tightly. He wasn't reading anymore, just holding. The red-haired woman beside him shifted again, stealing a quick glance in his direction. Her mouth opened like she might say something, but then she closed it, turned a page in her book and pretended to focus. He could feel her discomfort, not at him, but at the situation. She had seen it. She knew something wasn't right, but she didn't know what to do with that feeling. Most people didn't. They weren't used to calling out wrong when it wore a clean uniform and painted on a smile. He closed his eyes again, this time to think. What would happen if he spoke up? Nothing, probably. Maybe more coldness, maybe a warning, maybe nothing at all. He didn't want a scene. He didn't want people looking at him like he was the problem. He didn't want to be that kid, the one who makes everyone uncomfortable. And yet, a part of him was growing tired of shrinking himself just to keep others at ease. He reached slowly into the front pocket of his jeans and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with a soft glow. 1 bar of service. No Wi-Fi. He didn't need it. He slid through his home screen until he found the small blue icon in the bottom corner. It looked like a simple shield. No name. Just a shape. He tapped it. The app opened to a clean black screen with a single blinking cursor. No menu. No password prompt. Only a field for input. Jalen's thumb hovered over the keyboard for a moment. His heartbeat was steady, but he could feel it more now. Low in his chest, like something was waking up. He typed, Flight 228, Cabin Misconduct. Staff ID, SH-W398. Ongoing behavior pattern. Requesting silent review protocol. He didn't press send yet. He stared at the words on the screen, the way they glowed in the dim cabin light. Part of him still doubted himself. Was it really that serious? Was he making too much of it? Maybe she's just having a bad day. Maybe I'm just sensitive. But then he remembered how she looked when she skipped him. The tightness of her jaw, the way her tone flattened when she spoke to him, and only him. The way she pretended not to hear him, while making sure everyone else got what they needed. He remembered something else his father once said, years ago when Jalen was still small and didn't understand why people treated them differently in stores, in restaurants, in schools. The world won't always hit you with hate. Sometimes it'll just pretend you're not there. That kind of silence is loud, son, and you don't have to let it go unnoticed. Jalen pressed send. The screen blinked once, then returned to black. No sound, no confirmation, just silence. But somewhere, on a secure FAA server connected to civil rights complaints across the country, a digital flag was raised. Flight 228 was tagged. A log was created. Sharon's name was linked to the complaint, and every action moving forward would be watched without her even knowing. Jalen locked his phone and placed it back in his pocket. He didn't look around. He didn't speak. He simply opened his Bible again, found the folded page, and read the verse one more time. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. And so he was. Sharon returned to the aisle with the same polished posture and clipped smile. The cart rattled slightly as she pushed it, the soft clinks of plastic cups and bottles echoing across the quiet hum of the cabin. She stopped at row 13 and leaned in with friendly ease, offering orange juice and crackers to a toddler who squealed with delight. She laughed along, crouched low, and even gave the child a second cookie, just for being cute. The mother beamed. The interaction looked perfect, warm, kind, professional. Then she reached Jalen's row. She didn't speak, didn't offer anything. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the cart as she paused beside his seat, pretending to check a notepad she never looked at. Her eyes flicked to the Bible in his lap again, then to his hands and finally to his face. Her voice was flat, almost tired when she finally spoke. "Young man, I already told you. We're short on service today. You'll have to wait." Jalen didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He just turned the page of his Bible, slowly, as if her words had no weight. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand an explanation. But inside, something locked into place. A quiet understanding. She had chosen him, not because of anything he'd done, but because of what he looked like, how he dressed, what he carried. Because someone like him wasn't supposed to be confident, wasn't supposed to sit so still, wasn't supposed to stare back with calm eyes instead of lowered ones. The woman in 12B looked up again, clearly uncomfortable now. "I'm sorry," she said softly to Jalen. This doesn't feel right." He nodded once, gently. "It's okay," he replied. His voice was low but even. "You don't have to say anything." But it wasn't okay, and they both knew it. Sharon stood still for a beat too long, as if expecting a reaction, a complaint, a spark she could turn into blame. When none came, she moved on. The cart rolled ahead. The tension, though, stayed behind. Jalen let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It came out slow and measured but heavy. He leaned back in his seat, tilting his head slightly toward the window. Clouds drifted by, thick and soft, stretching far beyond what the eye could follow. Out there, everything looked peaceful. But in this narrow row, between two strangers and a system built on politeness that turned cruel the moment no one was watching, he felt every inch of his skin tighten. He thought again of his father. Michael Rivers had been a federal judge for over 20 years. In public, he was the very picture of control. Measured tone, pressed suits, clean glasses. But Jalen had seen him behind closed doors. He'd seen the weight that silence carried. The days when his father would come home from a courtroom where people refused to look him in the eye, where junior attorneys assumed he was the clerk, where his voice was second-guessed even when it held the gavel. His father never exploded. He built things instead. Systems, protocols, quiet channels for those who were never heard. The silent response protocol was his father's creation, hidden in plain sight, accessible only through a private app shared with a small network of advocacy partners, pilots, lawyers, civil rights officials, and trusted travelers. It existed for moments just like this. Jalen never imagined he'd need to use it. He thought maybe it was there for others, for people facing something bigger, something more obvious. But that's what made it so cruel, didn't it? It wasn't big, it wasn't loud. It was a missing cup of water, a fake smile, a glance that lasted too long, a hand that never offered help, a tone that changed like a switch being flipped. And now, a line had been crossed. He looked down at the Bible still open in his lap. The paper felt thinner than usual, or maybe his hands were heavier. His eyes moved down the page slowly. Words he'd read 1,000 times blurred slightly at the edges. He thought of the retreat in Seattle, the speech he was supposed to give about leading with integrity, about serving without pride. He wondered if this counted, if staying calm, doing what was right, and not reacting in anger was still service, or if he was just staying quiet like everyone else. A small part of him wanted to stand up, to say something, to ask why, to look Sharon in the eyes and demand the truth she would never admit. But the louder part, the steadier part, knew that wouldn't change anything. Not now, not here. He had already done what mattered, and the wheels were turning, even if no one could hear them yet. He pressed his back deeper into the seat, pulled his hood slightly over his head and closed his eyes. He didn't want to sleep. He wanted to think, to remember, to be ready. Because the next move wasn't his. Time moved slowly after that. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow as the flight settled into cruise altitude. The clinking of glasses and quiet conversations faded into a low, steady hum. A few people had pulled their window shades down. Others were dozing off with earbuds in. But Jalen stayed wide awake. He hadn't moved since Sharon passed him. His spine rested against the stiff cushion, but he never fully relaxed. His fingers remained loosely around the Bible, still open, though his eyes weren't reading anymore. They stared ahead, past the seat back into some fixed, invisible point only he could see. The stillness wasn't peace. It was tension wrapped in control. And even though he looked calm to the world, inside, his thoughts were thick and fast, each one bumping into the next like planes on a crowded runway. Why had she done it? He didn't ask for much. Just water. Just the basic service everyone else received without question. But the second she looked at him, she had already decided something. Maybe it was his skin. Maybe it was the Bible. Maybe it was the fact that he didn't shrink or mumble or look away. Maybe it was all of it. That question hung in his chest like an anchor. And still, he didn't want to assume the worst. That was the part that hurt the most. He wasn't angry, not the way people often imagined anger. It wasn't fire. It wasn't loud. It was slow and tired and aching. It was the kind of anger that came after 1,000 other little moments. So small they were almost nothing, but never quite nothing. Like paper cuts, one after another, until you couldn't move without feeling them. The soft ping of the intercom snapped him out of it. The captain's voice filled the cabin with a gentle southern accent. Ladies and gentlemen, we're making good time. We're currently passing over Nebraska airspace with smooth conditions. Expected arrival into Seattle is still on schedule, just over 3 hours from now. Please keep your seatbelts fastened when seated. Cabin crew will continue to serve refreshments shortly. Jalen watched Sharon appear again a few minutes later, pushing a new tray down the aisle with Daniel, the male flight attendant who had stayed mostly silent since boarding. Daniel was younger, maybe in his early 30s, with salt and pepper hair neatly combed to one side. His face was hard to read. He had seen what happened earlier, Jalen was sure of it. He had been a few rows down when Sharon brushed him off the first time. But Daniel had stayed out of it. No nod, no glance. Just quiet complicity. Jalen had seen that kind of silence before, too. Now Sharon was all smiles again, refilling drinks and asking passengers if they wanted ice or lemon. Daniel followed close behind, handing out napkins and snacks, his voice polite but distant. When they reached Jalen's row, Sharon slowed down but didn't stop. Daniel hesitated. He looked at Jalen for the first time, really looked at him. There was something cautious in his expression, like he knew the air was different here, like he felt the quiet tension lingering around seat 12A and didn't want to be part of it. Then finally, he spoke. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" he asked. His tone was even, professional. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. Jalen looked up, holding Daniel's eyes. He nodded once. "Water, please." Daniel reached for a bottle and poured it carefully into a small plastic cup. No ice, no extra gesture. But still, he handed it over without a word, without hesitation. Sharon didn't say anything. She looked ahead, lips tight, and pushed the cart forward. Daniel followed. Jalen held the cup in his hand, feeling the chill against his skin. It wasn't much, just water. But even that felt like something had shifted, slightly. The woman in 12B turned her head and gave him a small nod. Not a smile, not pity, just a nod that said, "I saw it too. I'm still here." Jalen sipped slowly, letting the water cool his throat. He glanced down at the Bible again and thought, not of the verse this time, but of the person he was becoming. His father had once told him, "There's no power like knowing when to stay still and when to move. Just don't let the world decide for you." He didn't know which one this moment was yet, stillness or movement. But he knew something now, more clearly than before. This wasn't about the water. It never was. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight passed into evening sky. A calm silence took over, broken only by the hum of engines and the soft shuffle of blankets and seat reclines. Most of the passengers had slipped into quiet rest, their trays cleared, screens off. But Jalen Rivers sat upright in 12A, fully awake, his body still and his mind restless. He held the now empty water cup in both hands, slowly rotating it between his palms. The plastic had gone warm. A single drop clung to the rim, trembling with each slight movement. He stared at it for a while, not because it mattered, but because it was something to focus on besides the knot forming in his chest. He could still feel the moment Sharon looked at him, not just saw him, but looked at him, the way some people glance at a stain on a clean shirt. A problem that shouldn't be there. He wasn't wearing anything flashy. No hoodie, no jewelry. His shirt was crisp, tucked in. His shoes were clean. He didn't speak loudly, didn't make a fuss. He was respectful. But none of that mattered. Because for her, the decision had been made before he ever spoke. And now, Jalen sat in his seat, trying to swallow the weight of it. Not just her behavior, but the silence that followed. From the crew, from the people sitting near him, from the airline system that had built 1,000 rules about safety, comfort, and customer satisfaction, but not one that could stop a quiet act of dismissal from slipping through unnoticed. He looked around the cabin. In front of him, the man in 11C was watching a movie on mute, smiling faintly. In 12B, the red-haired woman had finally closed her book and pulled a thin blanket over her lap. Her eyes closed, but her face still faintly creased with thought. A few rows back, someone snored softly. Everyone had moved on, except him, and Sharon. He could feel her, even now, moving up and down the aisle with practiced grace, offering tea and cookies like nothing happened. Like the boy in 12A hadn't been passed over 3 times. Like her hand hadn't snatched a Bible from his lap earlier with a smirk barely hidden behind company policy. Jalen hadn't told anyone about that moment yet. Not even the red-haired woman who had tried, in her quiet way, to bridge the gap. But he remembered every detail. The way Sharon reached for the Bible like it didn't matter. Like it was something in the way. And when his hand reached out to take it back, the way she slapped it. Fast, controlled, but real. The Bible had landed on the floor with a soft thud. And that moment, more than anything else, had stayed with him. She hadn't apologized, hadn't even acknowledged it, just walked away. He hadn't reacted. He had picked it up slowly, brushing off the corner, his hands trembling not from pain, but from restraint. Because if he had said anything in that moment, even calmly, someone would have labeled him disruptive, or worse, aggressive. He had learned that lesson early. Jalen looked down again at the book, resting now beside him on the seat. The gold lettering on the spine was slightly faded, one edge still bent from the fall. His grandmother's writing was still tucked into the back cover, a small note written in wobbly cursive on lined paper, folded into a square. He had read it dozens of times. He didn't need to unfold it to remember what it said. Keep your head up, baby. Some people won't see you, but that doesn't mean you disappear. He reached over and smoothed the bent corner of the Bible, pressing it flat with his thumb. Then he leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, just for a moment. But his thoughts didn't stop. He thought of the message he had sent, the silent response protocol. He wondered if it had reached anyone yet, if someone was already reviewing flight logs, crew files, passenger history. If someone, somewhere, was reading the name Sharon W398 and seeing the same patterns he saw. A soft voice that turned hard around certain people. A smile that never reached certain faces. A record of complaints brushed aside as lack of evidence. He wondered if Sharon had any idea what was coming. And then he wondered why he cared. He wasn't trying to ruin her career. That wasn't the point. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want her to be humiliated or dragged through the news. What he wanted, what he needed, was the kind of justice that didn't need cameras or microphones to matter. The kind that said, you were wrong, you crossed a line, and no one's pretending it didn't happen. For the first time since boarding, Jalen felt the edge of something solid underneath his thoughts. Not rage, not pride, just clarity. The kind his grandmother used to call God's voice in quiet places. He didn't know what would happen when the plane landed. He didn't know who had read his message or whether action would come right away, or at all. But he had acted. Calmly, quietly, without letting them shrink him. And that, in itself, was something. As he opened his eyes again and looked out the window, the clouds below had darkened to blue-gray. The sun had slipped below the horizon, but the sky still glowed faintly, like it hadn't given up just yet. Neither had he. Jalen didn't realize how tightly he was holding the Bible again until his fingers began to cramp. He released his grip slowly, stretching each finger out one by one until the ache softened. The skin along his knuckles had gone pale from pressure. He laid the Bible flat on his tray table, careful not to reopen the note tucked inside. Not yet. He didn't want to fall apart mid-flight. He just needed to stay steady until they landed. The flight felt endless now. The air was still. Too still. Like everything in the cabin had paused beneath the surface, waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. It reminded Jalen of church when he was younger, right after a hard sermon. That quiet tension, when the preacher stepped away from the pulpit, and the room held its breath, unsure whether to clap or pray or sit in silence. He reached up and pressed the air vent, letting a soft stream of cold air hit his forehead. It helped, but only a little. His chest still felt tight. Across the aisle, the man in 11C had taken out a tablet and was tapping through photos of some tropical beach. Smiling faces, umbrellas and frozen drinks. His laughter from earlier still seemed to hang in the air, even though he hadn't made a sound in over 30 minutes. Sharon had spent most of her time at his row, chatting, offering him second helpings, laughing a little too loudly. Jalen watched her from the corner of his eye. She was different now. Still smiling, still moving. But her eyes scanned the cabin in a way they hadn't before. A little quicker, a little sharper. Like someone had whispered that something was off, but she wasn't sure where the trouble was coming from. She glanced toward the back twice, once pausing near the galley to talk to another flight attendant in hushed tones. They kept their backs turned. But Jalen knew. She felt it. The kind of shift that doesn't make noise but tightens the air around you. And she was trying to figure out what it meant. Jalen reached for his phone again, sliding it from his pocket quietly. He kept it low on his lap, shielding the screen from view. The cabin's Wi-Fi was still off, but the app he'd used didn't need it. It ran through a private signal pinged from onboard FAA channels. He opened the secure log. A new message had arrived. Silent response protocol accepted. Case ID assigned. Cabin crew member flagged for preliminary review. Incident logged. Misconduct/discriminatory behavior. Next step, in-flight monitoring active. He read the words 3 times. They were brief, clinical. But to him, they felt like a deep breath after holding air too long. The system had seen him. Not just the app. The system. Somewhere, someone beyond this plane now had her name. Her actions. A timeline. It was already happening. He put the phone away, quietly, and leaned back against the seat. Part of him wanted to cry, not from sadness or fear, but from something he couldn't quite name. A release, maybe. The ache of holding something alone for too long. It was strange how quickly shame could wrap around you even when you'd done nothing wrong. He kept replaying everything in his mind, wondering if maybe he had imagined it, if it really was that bad. But now, with this message on his screen, he had confirmation. No, he hadn't imagined it. No, he wasn't being too sensitive. No, this wasn't just a bad day. It was something real, and now it would be on record. He sat still for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't check the time. He didn't even notice when Sharon walked by again, though her steps slowed near his row. Maybe she sensed something now. Maybe she noticed how he hadn't asked for anything since Daniel handed him that cup of water. Maybe she caught the way his eyes didn't drop anymore when she passed. But she said nothing. And he didn't look at her. The silence between them was different now. It no longer belonged to her. It belonged to him. Jalen turned toward the window again. The clouds were gone now. Only the soft glow of city lights far below shimmered through the dark. Thousands of lives, flickering like stars across the country. People moving through the world unaware that a plane above them carried a boy who refused to shrink, who refused to let his pain be ignored. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and whispered, almost under his breath, "Let the system speak." And somewhere deep inside, he believed it finally would. The quiet didn't lift, but it changed. It wasn't the emptiness of being ignored anymore. It was the weight of something beginning. Something that had no name yet, but had already taken root. Jalen felt it in the air, in the rhythm of his breathing, in the stillness of his hands now resting loosely over the Bible. He had done what he could. The system was awake. But that didn't mean the tension was gone. He closed his eyes for a few seconds and tried to imagine the moment they'd land. The wheels hitting the ground. The thud. The silence right before the passengers burst into motion. Seat belts clicking. Overhead bins opening. Elbows squeezing into the aisle. Would anyone know? Would they see Sharon walk off the plane looking composed, her bag slung over her shoulder, thinking nothing had happened? Or would something stop her? He opened his eyes again. No answers. Just that flicker of unrest in his chest. He needed something steady to hold on to, so he turned the Bible over, opened the back cover, and slowly unfolded the note his grandmother had left him. The creases were soft now from being opened so many times, but he never got tired of reading it. The ink was faded, the handwriting shaky, some letters slanted, some uneven. but her voice lived in it all the same. You don't fight with your hands, baby. You fight with your light. And your light don't come from people seeing you. It comes from you seeing yourself clearly, even when they refuse to. He read the line again and again. Each time it landed heavier. That was the fight, wasn't it? Not the slap, not the tone, not the skipped drink. It was the refusal to be seen, to be acknowledged as someone who belonged in seat 12A just as much as anyone else in rows 1 through 30. He folded the note and slid it back into the pocket. Someone in the back of the plane coughed sharply. Then a baby fussed for a moment before being rocked quiet again. A steward call bell dinged 2 rows up. Ordinary sounds. The flight was still moving forward, still pretending to be normal. But Jalen knew better. He knew the moments before impact were often the most deceptive. From the corner of his eye, he saw Sharon walking down the aisle again. No cart this time. Just her, arms folded loosely in front of her waist, the small company pin still fixed to her vest. She paused a little too long at row 10, made some excuse to adjust a tray table. He could feel her glance sliding his way like a shadow stretching too far. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Let her see him now, not angry, not rattled, just steady. Her footsteps continued. Her posture was tighter now, no longer gliding with ease. She was moving like someone trying to keep balance on a floor that wasn't quite level. Jalen wondered if she felt it. The change. That quiet shift when someone who expected silence realizes silence can speak. Loudly, permanently. His mind drifted to the system on the other end of the app. What were they doing now? Pulling records? Watching cabin footage? Cross-referencing past complaints? He hoped someone was paying attention to patterns, not just isolated moments. Because that was the real harm. Not what happened once, but what happened over and over, hidden behind smiles, behind just doing my job. Behind it must have been a mistake. He thought of other passengers who might have sat in his seat before. The ones who didn't have access to a private app, or a father with FAA connections, or a platform to make noise. How many of them walked off the plane in silence, holding something heavy in their chest they couldn't name? How many of them carried it home, folded it away, told themselves it didn't matter? He wasn't angry for himself anymore. He was angry for them. The woman in 12B stirred beside him, adjusting her blanket and stretching slightly before sitting up straighter. She glanced at him, her expression soft. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. "Yeah," he said. Then after a pause, "Thank you for earlier." She smiled, a tired kind of smile, the kind people give when they don't know what else to say but want to mean something anyway. "Didn't feel right," she replied. He looked at her for a long moment. "It wasn't." She nodded, her eyes dropping to the tray table. People don't like when the quiet ones push back. Jalen let out a short breath, half laugh, half exhale. They think quiet means weak. "Sometimes it does," she said. "But not tonight." Her words settled in his chest, anchoring something that had been drifting since the moment Sharon's hand brushed his. He didn't need validation, but still, it mattered. It always did, whether people admitted it or not. Outside the window, the last stretch of night had turned navy blue. A faint line of orange had begun forming along the edge of the earth. The sun was rising, and Jalen sat up just a little straighter in his seat. The glow of the rising sun edged higher across the horizon, painting soft amber streaks across the clouds below. The darkness of night hadn't fully let go yet, but it was fading, slowly, stubbornly, like something that knew its time was up but wasn't ready to leave. Jalen watched it unfold through the small oval window beside him, one arm resting on the edge of the seat, his forehead just inches from the glass. The world looked peaceful from up here. Too peaceful, maybe. Inside the cabin, passengers began to stir. Seatbacks creaked upright. A few window shades flipped open, letting in slivers of light that stretched across arms and tray tables. The flight attendants were moving again, preparing for the final service before descent. But there was a different energy now. Not tension exactly, but caution. Measured movements, half smiles, eyes that darted more than they used to. Sharon walked more slowly down the aisle this time, clutching a clipboard and checking things that didn't seem urgent. Her smile had narrowed to a line, not forced, not warm, just there, like a wall meant to keep distance instead of welcome. She passed Jalen's row again, and this time she didn't even pretend to look away casually. Her eyes met his, fast and sharp, like a question, like a challenge. Jalen didn't flinch. He didn't blink either. He simply looked at her, steady and quiet, his face unreadable. Not angry, not smug, just still. And in that split second, something passed between them that didn't need words. She knew. He knew she knew. She turned away. He leaned back into his seat and let out a breath through his nose, slow and controlled. The knot in his stomach loosened, just a little. Not gone, but not choking him anymore either. Beside him, the woman in 12B pulled her tray table down and started packing away the last of her things. She hadn't said anything else since their brief exchange earlier, but every so often, she'd glance sideways as if to check if he was okay without asking. Jalen appreciated that. He didn't want more conversation. He just wanted space to feel what he was feeling without needing to explain it. He wasn't used to being the center of anything, not at school, not at church, not even at home. He was the background type, the calm one, the polite one, the boy people called mature for his age. It used to feel like a compliment. Now it just felt like another way of saying, "You don't make us uncomfortable." But for once his silence had made someone uncomfortable. And he wasn't sorry. He reached for his phone again, his thumb hesitating for just a moment before unlocking it. Another update from the silent response app had arrived. Case escalation. Live monitoring confirmed. FAA oversight has been notified. Crew member flagged for multiple pattern indicators. Recommendation. In-flight debrief upon landing. Status. Confidential action pending. Jalen stared at the words, not because he didn't understand them, but because they made it real. More real than anything Sharon had done. More real than his anger. More real than the ache in his chest or the tightness in his throat. This was happening. They weren't ignoring it. They weren't shelving it. They were acting. A part of him felt something like relief, but heavier. Not joy, not victory, just weight coming off his back one brick at a time. But that same part also worried. What would happen next? What would they say when they pulled her aside? Would she lie? Would she twist the story? Would the people on board even notice what was really going on? And then a deeper thought. Would it even matter? Because if the system that let her act this way didn't change, then none of this did. He closed the message and tucked the phone back into his jacket pocket. His reflection in the window looked older somehow. Not in his face, but in the way he held himself, like something had been shed, and something harder had grown in its place. The seatbelt light chimed above them. The pilot's voice crackled through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our initial descent into Seattle in the next few minutes. Please return your seats to the upright position, stow all trays and personal items, and ensure your seatbelt is securely fastened." Jalen sat up straighter. He folded his tray, placed the Bible neatly back into his backpack, zipped it carefully. He moved slowly with purpose. Nothing rushed, nothing reactive. Sharon passed by one more time. This time she said nothing. She didn't ask if he needed anything, didn't offer help, but her eyes flicked to his bag, to his hands, to the seat in front of him, watching, measuring. He didn't give her anything. Not a nod, not a glare, not a word. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was power. He felt it now, not because he had yelled or exposed or forced anyone to listen, but because he had refused to disappear, because he had stayed and sat and waited, not for approval, but for accountability. The plane tilted downward as it began its slow glide toward Seattle. The engines shifted tone. The lights dimmed again, just slightly, just enough to cast long shadows down the aisle. Jalen gripped the armrest as the aircraft descended, not out of fear, but because this part, this moment, was what everything had led to. the part where the truth would land. The nose of the plane dipped gently as the descent began. The low roar of the engines shifted into a softer hum, steady and deep, like the breath of something heavy settling into rest. Passengers began waking up more fully now, stretching, blinking, fixing their hair in phone screens. The cabin buzzed again, but with a quiet sort of energy. The kind people have when they're almost home, already imagining luggage carousels and front doors and the sound of familiar voices on the other side of baggage claim. But Jalen Rivers wasn't thinking about home. He was staring out the window, watching the distant city grow closer, each building and highway lighting up slowly in the morning haze. The world below felt sharp, real, too real. He could almost make out the tops of trees, the clean lines of parking lots, the motion of early traffic weaving its way through still sleepy streets. The distance between his seat and solid ground was shrinking, second by second, and with it, the space between what had happened and what was about to begin. He shifted in his seat, just slightly, adjusting the straps on his backpack. His fingers brushed over the top of the Bible tucked inside, his grandmother's Bible, like a silent reminder that he wasn't here by accident. He hadn't imagined this. He wasn't overreacting, he hadn't made it up. But still, a voice in his head whispered, "Are you sure you did the right thing?" That voice didn't belong to anyone else. It was his. It was the part of him that had learned to survive by being cautious. The part that had been taught, directly or indirectly, not to speak unless he was asked, not to make things harder for others, not to bring attention, not to be that kid. He thought back to the moment Sharon slapped his hand, how fast it had happened, how no one had really noticed, how his fingers had stung, not from the force, but from the weight of being made invisible in such a visible place. How quiet he had gone after that. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. He had felt that heat rise in his chest, that spark behind the eyes, but instead of letting it burn outward, he'd forced it down, folded it up, put it away. Because the world doesn't always give black boys the freedom to speak with fire, only with proof, only with silence that's useful. And now, that silence had become something else. A thread pulled, a system triggered, a flight watched. He remembered the app's last update. Crew member flagged for multiple pattern indicators. In-flight debrief upon landing. What would that look like? He imagined her, Sharon, being asked to stay behind. Her name being called over a handheld radio. A firm voice saying, "Ma'am, we'll need a few minutes of your time before you exit the plane." Her confused smile, the way she might pretend to be surprised, offended even. He imagined her deflecting, claiming miscommunication, saying he seemed hostile or that he made her uncomfortable. That word, uncomfortable. It was always used to reverse the roles, turn the accused into the victim, paint stillness as a threat. Jalen knew all the scripts, but he had something more than a complaint. He had a record, a timestamp, a history, and most of all, he had her pattern. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the descent more clearly now. The soft press of gravity nudged him back into the seat. His heart beat a little faster, not from fear, not from doubt, but from the weight of what was waiting at the gate. There was no turning back. Next to him, the woman in 12B cleared her throat gently. "We're almost there," she said. Her voice was soft but firm. "You holding up okay?" Jalen opened his eyes and turned to her. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I think I am." She gave him a small nod and looked out her own window. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer advice, just sat there beside him, present. And that was enough. Few rows ahead, Daniel, the male attendant, moved briskly down the aisle with a clipboard. His expression was different now. Tighter, alert, like he'd been told something he wasn't allowed to repeat. His steps slowed when he neared their row, but he didn't stop. Just a quick glance at Jalen, then at the back of the plane, before continuing forward. Jalen noticed. Every movement meant something now. He glanced toward Sharon, who stood by the galley, her hands folded, staring ahead. Her jaw was tense, her back was straight, but her posture had changed. no longer floating with ease. Now she stood like someone waiting for a decision to be made. Maybe she had been told too. The final announcement came over the speaker. The usual lines: "Thank you for flying, remain seated." The seatbelt sign would turn off soon, and then the quiet click of the landing gear unfolding beneath them. A rumble, a dip, a shift in pressure. Then, the hard thunk as the plane touched down. The wheels screamed softly against the tarmac. A few passengers clapped, more out of habit than joy, and just like that, the plane began to slow, rolling toward the gate under the steel silence of the early morning sky. Jalen felt something in his chest settle, not because it was over, but because it was finally beginning. The aircraft coasted along the runway, its wheels thumping gently over the concrete seams as it taxied toward the gate. The soft vibration beneath Jalen's feet was steady now, predictable, like the closing lines of a song that had taken too long to end. A faint chime sounded, and the seatbelt sign clicked off. People immediately stirred. A symphony of movement followed: the shuffle of coats, the scraping of bags from overhead compartments, the low murmur of passengers speaking in soft morning voices. It was a familiar ritual. The shared script after every flight: stretch, smile politely, check your phone, wait for the aisle to open. But Jalen didn't move. He stayed seated, hands resting on his backpack, his Bible still zipped inside. His legs were tense beneath him, but he held them still. Something in him didn't want to be first, or fast. He wasn't ready to join the rhythm of people who would soon forget what happened in the air. The woman in 12B gave him another glance, her body half turned toward the aisle. "You want to go ahead of me?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I'll wait." She gave a small nod and didn't press. From his seat, Jalen had a clear view of the galley near the front of the plane. Sharon stood there, perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her like a hotel concierge. But the strain in her shoulders betrayed her. Her fingers tapped slightly against her knuckles, the movement barely visible. Her eyes weren't focused on anything. They were scanning, quick and sharp, watching, waiting. Jalen wondered what she had been told, if the pilot had spoken to her, if someone had pulled her aside with a clipboard and a quiet sentence: "We'll need to speak with you after disembarkation," or if it was only a feeling. That same feeling he'd carried in his stomach since her hand slapped his. That deep, pulsing sense that something had tilted without warning, and no amount of denial could balance it again. The flight door opened with a soft metallic hiss. A rush of cooler air crept in as the bridge connected. Passengers began filing out, slowly at first, then with more confidence. Row by row they moved forward, stretching and yawning and thanking the crew. One man clapped Sharon on the shoulder as he passed. "Great flight," he said. She smiled, almost automatically. It wasn't until row 11 began to stand that Daniel appeared from the back. But he wasn't moving like a flight attendant anymore. Not exactly. He had a tablet in one hand and a hard line in his jaw. His eyes were locked forward, watching the passengers disembark. When he reached Sharon, he paused, said something in a low tone. She didn't react at first. Then her eyes flicked toward the far end of the jet bridge. She nodded. Not a yes. A resigned nod. And for the first time since takeoff, her smile dropped completely. Daniel stepped aside and spoke into a small handheld radio. His voice was too quiet for Jalen to make out, but he could feel the shift in energy ripple down the aisle. A woman appeared at the cabin door, a uniformed employee, not flight crew. Her blazer had an FAA insignia on the lapel. She held a thin tablet and a folder pressed to her chest. She didn't smile either. Sharon stood a little straighter, her hands folded tighter. Jalen felt his breath catch, not from satisfaction, but from something deeper. He wasn't sure if it was relief or dread. Maybe both. He wasn't used to seeing consequences arrive in real time. Most of the time, things happened quietly, if they happened at all. People like Sharon didn't get pulled aside. They moved on. They laughed it off. They smoothed it over. But not today. The woman in 12B finally rose, gave Jalen one last glance and stepped into the aisle. "Take care, young man," she said softly. He nodded. "You too." When it was his turn to stand, he moved slowly. His knees ached from sitting still too long, but he didn't rush. He slipped the backpack over one shoulder, keeping a firm hand on the strap, and stepped into the aisle. A few heads turned, not many, but enough for him to feel it, the kind of glance people give when they sense something's going on but don't want to get involved. As he walked toward the front of the plane, his eyes locked briefly with Sharon's. She didn't look angry. She didn't look apologetic. She looked scared, not because of him, because of the system that now stood at the door. For a moment he felt something stir, something that almost looked like pity. But it vanished just as quickly. She had made her choice, repeatedly. And now the silence she had depended on had turned into something louder than a scream. Jalen walked past her without stopping. No glare, no smile. Just a boy with a backpack, walking off a plane. He stepped into the jet bridge. The lights were brighter here, harsher. A man in a dark suit was waiting at the end, holding a phone to his ear. Another woman in uniform stood nearby, watching a screen with incoming passenger data. But no one stopped him. He kept walking, one step after the other, out of the aircraft, out of that cold seat, out of her shadow. And somewhere behind him, in that narrow, well-lit cabin, silence was finally being forced to speak. The hallway leading away from the gate was bright and quiet, too clean to feel real after the pressure of the flight. The floor was polished, the lights cold and even. Everything gleamed, but Jalen didn't notice much of it. His shoes moved forward on instinct, one after the other, while his mind lagged behind, still caught somewhere between the hum of the aircraft and the weight of the silence that had filled it. He glanced down briefly at the terminal floor, then lifted his eyes again. His hands were gripped tightly around the straps of his backpack, and he hadn't realized until that moment just how tightly. His palms were damp, his shoulders stiff. He loosened his grip slightly and rolled one shoulder to shake off the tension, but it didn't go away. This wasn't over. He knew that. It had only shifted forms. The moment he stepped off that plane, the story didn't end. It split. One part of it followed Sharon, now facing something she never expected from someone like him. And the other part, the quieter part, followed him. A boy with a Bible, a boy who didn't shout, a boy who did not flinch when she tried to erase him with a cold smirk and a clipped voice. A boy who chose not to become the thing they expected him to be. He kept walking, past the shops and kiosks, past the tired travelers checking flight screens, past children pulling colorful suitcases behind them, past a janitor mopping near a trash bin, humming faintly to himself. No one looked at Jalen twice. No one knew what had just happened on that plane, or who he had quietly become because of it. That anonymity, it felt strange, and freeing, and unfair. He pulled out his phone and checked the silent response app one more time, even though he knew no new updates would come just yet. The screen blinked once, the log remained sealed but active. Case status, escalated. In-flight report submitted to Ethics Committee, crew member under review, additional testimony may be requested. Jalen stared at the words. His name wasn't in them. His face wouldn't be in any news article. There would be no trending hashtag, no camera to capture his calm. But there was something else. Something more permanent. A record. A digital line connecting what happened to the truth that followed. And that mattered. He tucked the phone away again, slowed his steps and made his way to the baggage claim. His duffel bag, a plain black one with a single fraying strap, circled the carousel once before he stepped forward and grabbed it. The weight of it grounded him. It was familiar, tangible. Unlike the emotions still swirling inside him, guilt, pride, fear, and something else he hadn't yet named. He found an empty bench near the window and sat down, letting the duffel drop gently to the floor. His legs stretched out, but his shoulders remained pulled in tight. His mind raced again. What would happen now? Would Sharon be fired, reprimanded, reassigned quietly with no real consequence? Would the system act or just react? He didn't want revenge. That wasn't what this was about. But he did want truth. He did want change. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the Bible, opened it slowly. Not to the page with the verse he'd clung to throughout the flight, not to the folded letter from his grandmother, just somewhere in the middle. He let the pages fall open on their own and stared at the text without reading it. Sometimes it was enough just to hold it, to be reminded of where his voice came from. He didn't need a podium. He didn't need to raise his volume to be heard. His silence had already echoed where it needed to. His actions had already lit the fuse. What came next wasn't his to control, but it would bear his fingerprints. He thought again about the way Sharon looked at him before he walked off the plane, the stiffness in her jaw, the way her gaze hesitated, not defiant but unprepared. It wasn't just the fear of consequence. It was the realization that someone like him had access to power she never imagined. That power hadn't looked like shouting. It hadn't looked like confrontation. It had looked like a quiet boy in seat 12A, holding a Bible, watching everything, and choosing to speak where it mattered most, into the system that gave her a place to hide. Now she had nowhere to hide. And Jalen had nothing to regret. He closed the Bible gently and set it on his lap. The light through the tall windows spilled across the floor, warm and bright now, no longer tinted by dawn. The world had turned while he was in the air. And it had turned because of what happened in the air. He sat there a few more minutes before standing. The youth leadership retreat would start that afternoon, and he still had to check into the hotel, unpack, maybe write down a few thoughts before his speech. He didn't know what he would say yet, not exactly. But he knew how it would end. He would not talk about Sharon. He would not talk about slaps or silence or systems breaking. He would talk about stillness, and the kind of strength it takes to carry truth without raising your voice. And maybe, just maybe, he'd read a verse too. The cab ride from the airport to the hotel passed in silence. Jalen sat in the back seat, his backpack tucked beside him, the Bible resting flat across his lap like it belonged there, which, in a way, it always did. Outside the window, Seattle drifted by in soft motion. Morning light clung to the tops of the buildings. Trees blurred into storefronts. Neon signs flickered off as sunlight slowly took over the rhythm of the city. The driver, a quiet man with kind eyes, didn't ask questions. He didn't start small talk or fill the silence with weather updates. And for that, Jalen was quietly thankful. He wasn't ready to speak yet. Not out loud. Not about what happened. The world outside was moving like any other day, but something in him had changed during that flight, and that change was still settling, still deciding what it meant. He leaned his head against the window and let the vibrations of the road buzz through his skull. He wasn't replaying the slap anymore, or Sharon's face, or the look in her eyes as he walked past her at the plane door. He had turned that moment over too many times already. What stayed with him now were the things that didn't happen. The passengers who looked and looked away. The moments he could have stood up and didn't. The strange quiet pride he felt for not exploding. And the flicker of guilt that followed it. Did I do enough? Did I let her off too easy? Should I have said something to her face? The system would handle it. The protocol had been triggered. The complaint was active. The logs recorded. The decision wasn't his anymore. But the feeling was. The cab pulled up to the hotel entrance, an old building with ivy crawling up its stone columns and a brass-plated revolving door that spun too fast. Jalen paid the fare, thanked the driver, and stepped out onto the curb. His legs felt heavier than before. It was like the weight he'd carried emotionally had somehow crept into his body, hiding in the backs of his knees, in the bend of his elbows. The kind of weight you only feel after holding yourself together for too long. He checked in at the front desk, barely remembering the words he spoke. The young receptionist handed him a key card and gave him a standard welcome smile, one that didn't reach her eyes but wasn't cold either. Just practiced. She didn't know who he was or why his name had been passed through this hotel's conference list. And she didn't ask. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, the old metal doors groaning slightly as they opened. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and something older, like carpet that had seen too many years of shoes and luggage and secrets. His room was at the end. He opened the door and stood still for a moment before stepping in. It was simple. A bed, a desk, a chair, a lamp in the corner, pale walls, soft light from the window. He dropped his backpack by the armchair and sat down on the edge of the bed. His Bible rested in his lap again without him even noticing he'd pulled it out. He stared at it for a while. The cracked edges, the worn spine, the gold lettering almost faded to dust. His grandmother's handwriting in the back cover. The soul of everything he carried. He remembered the first time she read to him from it. He was 7, sitting on her porch, legs swinging off the edge, mosquitoes buzzing in the heat. She'd turned to him and said, "Baby, you know what they're gonna try to do? Make you forget your worth without ever saying a word. But God don't whisper lies. He speaks in truth. And when he's quiet, it's only 'cause he's watching who's listening." He was listening now. He turned to the folded letter again, the one she had slipped into the back of the Bible just before she passed. He had read it every year on his birthday. But now, something told him it was time again. Not because of a date, but because of what had just happened. You fight with your light. That line. Again and again. He laid back on the bed, the Bible still resting on his chest. He looked up at the ceiling, but his eyes weren't focused. His body was still, but inside, his mind walked laps around everything. Not all of it was clear. Not all of it made sense yet. There was no big speech playing in his head, no dramatic words forming. But there was something stronger than language moving through him. A kind of knowing that something had cracked in that airplane cabin, not just in the surface of Sharon's mask, but in the shell of silence that people like her depended on. And he had cracked it without shouting, without standing, without fire, only by not shrinking. There was a knock on the door. 2 soft taps. Jalen sat up, placed the Bible on the desk gently, and crossed the room. He opened the door slowly. A young woman stood there, a retreat organizer, maybe in her mid-20s, with a lanyard and a clipboard and a warm, slightly nervous smile. "Hi," she said. "You're Jalen Rivers, right? We're finalizing the speaking order for this afternoon. We weren't sure if you'd arrived yet." He nodded. "Just got in." "Good," she said with a little breath of relief. "You're closing the first session. I know you probably have your own notes, but if you need anything, water, mic check, anything at all, let me know." "Thanks," he said. "I'm good." She started to turn, then paused. "Oh, and, sorry, this is random, but someone on our staff said they saw your name mentioned in an internal FAA dispatch this morning. Something about a flight, you okay?" Jalen looked at her for a second, not startled, just unsure how to answer. He nodded once, calm and slow. "Yeah, I'm okay." And he was, not light, not yet, but grounded and ready. The conference room was quiet except for the low hum of the overhead lights and the soft scrape of a chair being adjusted here and there. Rows of folding seats curved gently toward the front of the room, where a small wooden podium stood under a narrow spotlight. The air smelled faintly of paper, fresh coffee, and old carpet. A few dozen young attendees, some around Jalen's age, some a little older, sat scattered across the room, many holding notepads or phones, some just watching, listening. Jalen stood near the side curtain, his speech folded neatly in one hand, though he hadn't looked at it in over an hour. He had written something on the plane, simple thoughts, a few verses, some reflections about leadership, about faith. But that version of himself, the one who sat quietly in 12A, still unsure if he should press send, wasn't the same boy now waiting to walk up to that microphone. He glanced down at his hands. They weren't shaking. That surprised him. They weren't stiff either. Just steady. Ready. He thought about all the moments in his life when someone had told him to wait his turn, to not overreact, to stay calm for everyone else's comfort, to make things easier. This was not one of those moments. A woman from the organizing committee stepped to the side of the stage and whispered, "You're up, Jalen." He nodded once, then walked slowly toward the podium. Not nervous, not proud, just present. As he stepped into the light, the soft buzz of conversation faded. Heads turned, phones were lowered, and then silence. He stood still for a long moment, the mic untouched, his folded paper still resting in his hand. Then he looked out at the room, not above them, not past them, but at them. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Before I say anything I planned," he began, "I want to tell you something that wasn't in my notes." He paused. A breath. "I flew here this morning. You know, just like anyone else would. I boarded, sat down, kept to myself. I wasn't wearing anything flashy. I wasn't doing anything unusual. Just a 17-year-old kid with a Bible in his lap, heading to speak about leadership." A few people nodded. Others leaned in. But something happened. Something small. Quiet, so quiet it almost didn't matter. He looked down, then back up. Except it did. He told them. Not the whole story, not with every detail, but enough to feel the weight of it. He told them about the tone, the skipped drink, the slap, the silence, the application, the call he made without making a sound, and the shift. The feeling when the air changes and you know that you've taken up space in a way that someone didn't expect or want. He didn't name Sharon. He didn't speak with bitterness, but his voice didn't shake. He let the pauses land, let the silence echo. And then he said softly but clearly, "We talk about leadership like it's a podium, like it's about being first or loud or followed. But sometimes leadership is a boy in seat 12A who doesn't raise his voice and still refuses to disappear." A stillness settled over the room. Not the uncomfortable kind, the reverent kind, the kind that happens in church right after the last note of a hymn. He unfolded his paper then, but didn't read it. "I was going to talk today about courage, about the courage to serve. But I think it's also about the courage not to perform for people who've already decided what you are." He looked out at them, faces now focused, some caught mid-breath. "I didn't come here to make noise," he continued, "but I did come to tell the truth. And my truth is, sometimes the quietest resistance is the most powerful thing you can do." He paused, then added one last thing. "My grandmother once told me, they'll try to make you forget your worth without ever raising their voice. But God doesn't whisper lies, he speaks in truth. And when he's quiet, he's watching who's listening." Jalen stepped back slightly from the mic, folding the paper again. "I'm listening now." And then he stepped down. No applause at first, just a long, still moment. Then someone stood, then another. And soon the room filled with the sound of hands clapping, not because of what he said, but because of what he had carried in silence, and finally sat down. He walked off the stage quietly, the folded speech still in his hand, back into the room, back into his name, back into the space he had claimed not with anger, but with unwavering presence. And as the doors of the conference room closed behind him, the only sound in his chest was the steady beat of a boy who knew, finally, fully, that being seen did not require shouting. It only required staying. This wasn't just a story about a flight. It was about quiet strength, and what happens when someone refuses to stay invisible. If this story moved you, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.